Sukhoi SU-27 is classified as a Russian fourth-generation fighter. In the late 1970s, this multi-role air superiority specialty fighter was developed as a counterpart to compete against the F-14 Tomcat and F-15 Eagle. Since entering into service in 1985, there are a total of 23 different variants, all of which are widely praised for their tenacity and agility while performing high-speed maneuvers. Hi there, and welcome to our channel. We invite you to sit back and relax as you join us on an exciting model building adventure. I'm always pleased when the box art is a photograph of the finished model. While it may not serve as an ideal reference picture, it does give one a general impression of what to expect for a final result. There were not a great deal of parts to the kit. The clear bits were wrapped separately and were scratch-free with enough details to allow canopy masks to be applied easily. The decal sheet was rather small, but it was a good quality print and actually contained a fair amount of small water slide decals. Most of the bits were attached to two large sprue frames, and everything looked nicely detailed. Unfortunately, almost all of the parts had raised panel lines, which are notoriously difficult to accentuate. The most radical action would be to sand off the panel lines and rescribe them. However, when I examined the box art up close, I noticed that the model builder had used a pencil to accentuate the lower part of each panel line, which was a clever way to create a forced shadow in those areas. I should try this technique sometime, but for this build I was going to use a trusty old pin wash to accentuate the aircraft's various panel details. For me personally, the best part about building a Tamiya kit, besides the great way that the parts fit together, is that one gets paint callouts from my favorite Tamiya range. The instructions were in Japanese, which was a bit of a language barrier for me. They were printed on a large fold-out, but luckily there were lots of clear illustrations which made it easy to follow each step in the build process. There were also plenty of paint call-outs for the smaller parts in the instructions, and several optional steps were available which would allow the model builder alternative ways to display the finished model. The decal placement was a bit difficult to follow, but here again, the box art was a great source of reference. I removed the parts for the cockpit from their sprues and assembled the various interior elements. This was a fairly straightforward process, and I followed it up with a simple black base coat. The interior was airbrushed with a light grey. I applied some red paint to the pilot's seat. Some of the details of the instrument panels were picked out with a fine paintbrush. Once all of the parts were painted up, everything could be glued in to complete the cockpit sub-assembly. After a quick wash with some army painted dark tone, the cockpit was ready for installation. I used the same black base coat as before on the cockpit area of the upper fuselage, and followed this with a layer of grey paint to match the rest of the cockpit sub-assembly. Finally, all of the parts were glued into place, and the two halves of the fuselage were glued together. I filled the small gaps with some modless putty and sanded these carefully until smooth. Luckily, the parts were a good fit, so I didn't need too much elbow grease this time around. The wings and horizontal stabilizers were glued to the fuselage. I used some clamps to keep everything in position while the adhesive did its job. The air intakes were a bit tricky to assemble. Eventually, I added some support in the form of rolled up paper to hold the parts in position until they were dry. The air intakes were positioned on the lower fuselage and glued in carefully. My plan was to build this model with landing gear up as if it were in flight. To this end, I glued all of the wheelbase in a closed position. Next, I glued in the canards on the front part of the aircraft. Strictly speaking, The version of the SU-27 which I was building did not have these canards, but they looked so awesome that I decided to add them anyway. The SU-27 Flanker is extremely agile and is famous for being one of only a handful of aircraft which can perform the Cobra maneuver. Also known as Pugachev's Cobra, it is a dramatic and demanding maneuver in which an airplane flying at a moderate speed suddenly raises its nose into a vertical position and slightly beyond, causing a full body air brake and then dropping back to normal without a change in altitude. The maneuver relies on the ability of the plane to quickly change its angle of attack to momentarily stall the plane without overloading its airframe. Of course, Swedish pilots pioneered this maneuver in the Saab J-35 Draken several decades before Viktor Pugachev's performance at an airshow in 1989. I applied a couple of light coats of alk-clad gloss black to base coat the rear engine parts. This was in preparation for the metallic paints which were to follow. I started with an initial coat of aluminium, which I applied sparingly to the upper and lower fuselage. It dried almost instantaneously with a nice metallic luster. The rear parts of the engines were glued into position, starting with the turbofan blades and followed by the two sections of each nozzle. Several masks were placed on the engine access panels, and a second metallic coat of alk-clad dark steel was applied using an airbrush. This too was masked off, and a final layer of alk-clad gold was sprayed on very lightly. After a few minutes of drying time, all of the masks were removed carefully, using a blunt toothpick to avoid scratching the paint. The effect created by the different metallic colors was very subtle, yet quite effective. With the engines done, I glued the canopy glass to the cockpit. The engines were masked off for protection, and I carefully applied the canopy masks to prepare the model for its base coat. Likewise, some plastic foam was used to protect the air intakes. The aircraft was coated in a thin layer of Tamiya grey surface primer, which was left to dry overnight. Because there are so many variants of the SU-27 Flanker, there is a wealth of color schemes and camouflage patterns to choose from. I finally settled on the Arctic Blizzard camo pattern. Of course, the aircraft pictured doesn't have canards, unlike the model I was building, so I just had to ad hoc a camo scheme for those areas. The Sukhoi SU-27 had its first flight in 1977 and entered into active service in the Russian Air Force in 1985. This fourth-generation fighter is powered by two Saturn AL-31F afterburning turbofan engines and has a service ceiling of 19,000 meters. It can climb upwards at a crazy rate of 300 meters per second, which puts about 9 Gs of force on the pilot. At altitude, it has a top speed of Mach 2.35 and can fly at Mach 1.13 at sea level. It has a range of about 3.5 thousand kilometers at altitude and around 1.3 thousand kilometers at sea level. I decided to use a mottled undercoat as a starting point before applying the various layers which make up the camouflage pattern. I covered the entire aircraft, top and bottom, with a random pattern of Tamiya German grey. I remembered to apply the same pattern to both of the vertical stabilizers. This was followed by a coat of Tamiya matte white paint. While I painted, I tried to follow the panel lines as much as possible in order to create a bit of pre-shading which would help to accentuate those raised panel lines. I masked off all of the white areas, following the design on the reference picture as closely as possible. Then it was time to apply some Tamiya light sea grey. Once again, I started out with a mottled pattern and then blended the effect with an even coat across the entire surface. The same steps were repeated for the vertical stabilizers. Once the light sea grey had dried, I added a second set of masks to prepare for the last layer on the upper fuselage. I used German grey mixed with black for the final component of this camouflage pattern. This time I used the airbrush and sprayed in a random pattern across all of the unmasked areas. The masks were removed carefully, and I was pleased to see that there were only a few minor areas which would need some touch-ups. I diluted some light sea grey with Tamiya XF2 flat white and applied it to the underside of the aircraft. After a quick coat of gloss varnish, I applied the decals which were included in the kit. Some micro sol was added to soften the decals and help them conform with the surface details of the model. And with that, it was time to glue in the vertical stabilizers. The camouflage pattern was different for the two stabilizers, so I was careful to mark them as port and starboard before painting. After another light coat of gloss varnish to seal in the decals, I applied some panel line accent color to both the raised and recessed panel lines. I made sure to get some wash in all of those air intakes and other small details, and wiped off the excess with a soft cotton cloth. When everything was dry, I applied a final layer of flat varnish. I always use Alclad 313 clear coat matte for this job, as it doesn't form a white residue after it dries, unlike many other matte varnishes. Once dry, I added the flanker's ordnance, completely mixing up the placement at first, but I fixed everything later. The canopy masks were removed very slowly, and I took care not to scratch the clear parts. At last the engine masks could come off too. I used some weathering powder to dirty up the engines a little, and to create a burnt metal appearance. To finish up the build, I added the pitot tube, infrared tracking, and pitot static tubes. These were all painted to match the color of the aircraft, and with that she was done. The Sukhoi SU-27 is still regarded as a formidable fighter, and with an airframe so successful that it has been reused and upgraded to many newer versions of the aircraft. The latest version is the SU-35, which is classified as a Generation 4++ fighter, and was first deployed in Syria in January of 2016. So long, and thank you for watching.